When I was invited to give a talk here, I actually wanted to talk about the Indian Ocean, the topic of the book that is for sale outside. But I was told, no, talk about the Rohingyas and Aung San Suu Kyi instead. So, well, why not? I had to obey the instructions. But nevertheless, let's start then with this lady, Aung San Suu Kyi, and later on about the Rohingyas. So many people are asking themselves, what happened to her? The pro-democracy icon who became an international pariah, who turned from being something like a nation Nelson Mandela to a racist bigot, and whatever she's been called in international media. But in order to understand this, we actually have to look back at her life, a little bit about her political career, if you may call it that. And I usually divide it into three different periods. The first is 1988 to 89. It was during and after a nationwide pro-democracy uprising in Burma. And she emerged as the leader of that movement, partly, but not only, because she was the daughter of Aung San, Burma's independence hero, who was assassinated in 1947, 6 months before the country became independent. She looked like him, she spoke like him, and people could immediately relate to her. And her message was very clear and loud that the country needed political change. It needed transformation from a military-dominated dictatorship to a more open society. But then she was placed under house arrest in 1989 and released in 1995 for the first time. And after 6 years under house arrest, it's clear that she had undergone certain changes. But then she was in and out of house arrest for another few years, and she wasn't really released until 2010, which was shortly after a general election that was held in November that year, which brought the military-dominated Union Solidarity, USDP, Union Solidarity and Development Party to power after a blatantly rigged election. But nevertheless, it led to more openness in the country and a completely new political period. And then she emerged again as a national leader. But I would say that things had changed in the country, and perhaps also with her during that period. And first of all, we have to remember that her first period from 88 to 89 was very brief, less than a year. And at that time, I met her, and that's also when I got to know her personally. And she was definitely a very outspoken critic of military rule. The Burmese she spoke at meetings was very clear. My own Burmese was very rudimentary, but even I could understand what she was saying. And I went to a meeting where there were thousands of people, and she spoke for hours and nobody left. Even the children were there and listened carefully. So she was a charismatic leader. She was the sort of thing that the country needed at that period of time, that time in modern history. But the propaganda against her from the military was massive. And they concentrated on mainly one issue. She's not really Burmese. She lived abroad for so many years. When she was 15 years old, she went to live in New Delhi when her mother became Burma's ambassador to India. After that, she was in the UK for years. She was married to an Englishman. She's actually British. She should go home to the UK. This was the propaganda that was repeated over and over and over again. So when she was released in 1995, one of the first things she tried to do, and I think there was a serious mistake on her part, she didn't have to do that. She wanted to prove her Burmese-ness, that she was really a Burmese, although she had lived abroad for many years. She still spoke Burmese, beautiful Burmese, and she was a Burmese, even if she had been living not in exile, because she had gone to live in the UK voluntarily. But nevertheless, she started using Pali, references to Buddhism, things I never heard her say before. And, but still, it was something that people could put up with. It wasn't really that serious. But then after 2010, I think the military at that time thought that she had been forgotten, that nobody paid any attention to her anymore. That was a serious mistake, because she had not been forgotten. And she had not forgotten who she was. But again, she went out of her way to try to prove her Burmese-ness, the fact she was a Burman, that she was a Buddhist, and she belonged to their country, no other place on the planet. This is not to say that she hadn't shown other weaknesses before that. In 1989, just before she was placed under house arrest, she made her first trip, her last trip up country was to Myitkyina in Kachin State. And she traveled to other parts of the country before that as well. But this is a predominantly Christian part of northern Burma where people speak a different language. She was there dressed up in a Kachin traditional costume. It was very nice. But she had an interpreter translating her speech from Burmese into Jingpo, the main Kachin dialect. And I received a videotape in VHS in those days from this meeting, sent by her party, the NLD, to us in Bangkok. And I looked at it, and I thought, this is a little bit strange, because she said to them in Burmese that don't think of yourselves, first and foremost, as Kachin or Shan or Burma or Karen. We're all fighting together for democracy. You could see that her interpreter, who was a young Kachin lady, looked at her and with an expression on her face and said, you really want me to translate that? And she did, and you could see a reaction from the audience. People looked at each other. This was not what they had expected. That's what they wanted to hear. So it is quite clear, obvious to say that she's been rather insensitive to the ethnic issue from the very beginning. And in the very beginning, it didn't matter that much. But as the years went by, it did, and increasingly so. And then we also have to take into consideration that she was totally isolated under house arrest for years at end, with no one to talk to apart from the housemaid and the occasional intelligence officer who came to see her. Once in a while, or a few times, now late husband, Michael Harris, came to see her. But basically, she was really kept in isolation for years. Not like Nelson Mandela, who was on Robben Island and had a lot of prisoners to talk to. He even made friends with the prison guards there on the island. Aung San Suu Kyi was kept under almost total isolation and became, I think, more and more introspective. She was looking into herself, about her past and that sort of thing, in a way which it probably wasn't really necessary, but she did that, and out came not a completely different Aung San Suu Kyi, but an Aung San Suu Kyi which was different from 88, 89. In 2012, she traveled to Oslo. She'd just been elected as an MP. She went to Oslo in Norway to receive her Nobel Peace Prize, which she had been unable to receive when she got it in 1991 when she was in house arrest. And I was there as well and listened to her. And the speech she gave was peppered with Pali sentences, references to Buddhism, and things like, as we Burmese say, and there'll be something in Pali, which I never heard any Burmese I know ever say. And I was sitting there in the audience thinking again, please, this is not necessary. You don't have to prove that you are Burmese. We know that. Talk about something else. Talk about the future of your country, about the ethnic issue, the economic problems the country is facing. But then something else happened when I was in Oslo. It was in June 2012. There was a big celebration outside the city hall for her, and a lot of celebrities were there. There was music and dance and this and that, and Aung San Suu Kyi sat on the stage. And suddenly, I was standing there in the audience, but with thousands of other people, and on my mobile phone, this is the way we get news these days, something came in, clashes in Rakhine State between Muslims and Buddhists. Some Rohingyas, which is the predominant, but not the only, Muslim community in Rakhine State, which is also called Arakan, had allegedly raped a Buddhist girl. If it was true or not, we don't know. But a Buddhist crowd and a mob had then attacked a number of Muslims, dragged them off a bus, and killed them. And I remember looking at my phone at that time saying that, and I'm not the only one who observed this at the time, I will come back to that. I thought that this is going to be her downfall. Because whatever she does is going to be wrong. If she comes out condemning the attacks on the Muslims or the Rohingyas, she will get the public opinion against her. But if she came out condemning the attacks And if she came out condemning the attacks on the Muslims, she would get the domestic opinion against her. But if she did not, if she came out sort of defending the Buddhist point of view, she would get the international community against her. And if she did nothing, they would be wrong too. So she was actually caught in a situation where whatever she did would be wrong and work to her disadvantage. This I discussed much later with her main legal advisor, who was assassinated a couple of years ago. His name was Koni. And Koni was a Muslim himself, but not a Rohingya. He was a Muslim from central Burma. And he said to me that I told her the same thing in 2012. You will never be able to solve this problem. This will be used against you, and if you don't handle it carefully, you better watch out what's going to happen to your political career. So then, not that guy. Who are the Rohingyas then? Well, first of all, we have to remember that this is the sort of thing that come to dominate the narrative, it's going to dominate the news coverage. Everything from Burma has something to do with Rohingyas. But this is a country where it's seen ethnic conflicts for 70 years, since the independence in 1948. This is a country which has also many different Muslim communities. There are lots of Muslims of Indian origin living in all the major cities, where most of them are involved in businesses and so on. There are Chinese Muslims. In Burma, they call them Pante. In China, they call them Hui. And they are not from Devon, not Uyghurs, they're from Yunnan. And the Rohingyas are actually, I would say, a Muslim minority, and they live here. Basically in 3 townships in northern Rakhine State: Mongdo, Butidong, and Ratadong. And if you listen to the information is coming from pro-Rohingya groups, and there's nothing wrong with it, they can have whatever groups they want, that's not my argument. They claim that this is an old ethnic minority because in 1799, Francis Buchanan Hamilton, a British guy, wrote about the Rohingyas. Actually, no. Francis Buchanan Hamilton was sent from Calcutta by the East India Company to Amarapura in northern Burma, which was then the capital, or near modern-day Mandalay. And there he did meet some people who called themselves rohingya. But who they were, we don't know. We don't know what language they were spoken. They were Muslims, yes, but that's it. And it's only a couple of sentences in a much longer report from Amarapura. Later on, he did visit not Rakhine, but across the border in what is now southeastern Bangladesh, where he did a very thorough survey of ethnic groups in the region. And there he did not mention any Rohingya. But the term is actually fairly new. And again, that doesn't mean there's no legitimacy behind using the term Rohingya. We just have to understand how the history actually gave birth to a people called Rohingya, and why some people, in Burma especially, do not accept that term. Throughout the British era, they were called Chittagonians, because they speak the same dialect of Bengali as they do on the other side of the Naf River. And if you look at the map again, here, it's a typical frontier area. That's where South Asia ends and Southeast Asia begins. For hundreds of years, there have been Buddhists and Muslims living on both sides of the Naf River, and even Hindu communities. And the Naf River was not really, which is now the border between Bangladesh and Burma, was not really a border in the past. There was some obstacle you had to pass from one place to another. And during the British time, what was then called Arakan was developed into a granary for rice production for Bengal, because the land there is very fertile and rich and so on. So a number of workers came from what was then East Bengal and settled there. So the Muslim population increased. It's not to say there wasn't any Muslim population there before, there was. But the number of Muslims did increase through migration during the British colonial period. But again, this was all part of the British Empire. It was not an international frontier. But then came independence or preparations for independence in the 1940s. And then, of course, the various communities had to look for a new identity in the newly independent countries to be, right? So the Buddhists living from Chittagong, Cox's Bazar, and south, primarily in Bandarban in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, they're not Chakmas. They call themselves Marma. And Marma, they're actually Arakanese. They speak the Arakanese dialect of Burmese, very archaic form of Burmese, but it still is an R sound. Because in written Burmese, there are two letters both pronounced Y. That's Yagaut and Yapale. And one was originally an R. And when the British came to this country in the early 19th century, the translators came from Rakhine State because it was the first part of the country to be colonized. So they came to a town and they said, what's the name of this town? And the interpreters, Malaka, said, Rangoon. Whereas Burmese would pronounce it Yangon. But again, it's just depending on which dialect you want to talk, if you're talking about archaic Burmese or not. The first time I met the Marma, also in Bandarban, many years ago, and he came there dressed in a typical Arakanese longi, and his name was Aung Pru, which would be Aung Pyu in Burmese. So I said, are you a Marma? And he said, yeah. And I started to think that, I think I know where that name came from. So I gave him a piece of paper and said, can you please write it for me in your language? And he wrote, guess what? Mynamar. It'd be Mrama or Marma. So I said, why do you call yourself Marma or Mynamar? You're not Mynamar, you're Arakanese. Yeah, he said, but you know, in 1946, the Buddhists living there, of Arakanese origin, and many of them had actually fled there after the Burmans conquered the Arakan kingdom. It was once an independent kingdom in the 1780s. So they were sort of refugee population, might have been there for a very long period of time. But in 1946, one of the chieftains said that, look, they have to find a new identity in this new country we're going to belong to, Pakistan. Because this was, of course, East Pakistan. So he suggested that we should call ourselves Marma, because then we can have ourselves registered as a scheduled tribe under the Constitution and get privileges when it comes to getting government jobs and education. And they did. And the Marma, or actually Arakanese, became a scheduled tribe, and they also got all these privileges, and citizenship never had a problem. The Chittagonians, on the other side of the border, the Chittagonian Muslims, had a similar kind of movement occurred there, where they wanted a new identity in this newly independent country called Burma. And the fact that the Naf River, which has previously been a provincial boundary within the British Empire, was going to become an international border. So they were totally separated, right? But so there was, in the beginning, after independence in 1948 in Burma, an uprising among the Muslims of northern Arakan, in Mongdo, Butidang, and Ratidang. They did not call themselves Rohingya. They called themselves Mujahids. And they wanted to join Pakistan. But Pakistan said, no, we don't really want that. We don't want to change the border here. So that movement sort of fizzled out. But then in the early 50s, in the literature, the word Rohingya started to appear. And this doesn't, by any means that there's no legitimacy behind using this term. Just to show that it is a new term. It does not go back to Francis Buchanan Hamilton hundreds of years, anything like that. So in the 1950s, the Arakanese there started to call themselves Rohingya, but not all of them. If you also read in the Rohingya literature today, they said that during the 1950s, Rohingyas were even ministers in the central government. Well, don't use the plural there was one. And his name was Sultan Mahmud. He came from Butidang. But he did not call himself a Rohingya. He called himself an Arakanese Muslim. Because he thought that calling himself a Rohingya, it sort of smacks of separatism. We are Muslims, but we want to be recognized as citizens and residents of Arakan. And then you have other Muslim communities in Arakan as well. One group called Kaman Muslims. They have Burmese names. They don't speak any foreign language, really. They're also descendants of Bengali settlers who came there a very long time ago and were actually recruited by the old Arakanese kings because they needed some intellectuals to run the administration. They have Burmese names, they speak Burmese, they're citizens, and there's not any problem there at all. But what also happened then, after the military takeover in 1962, well, everything changed. In 1960, there were elections in Burma. UNU, the prime minister who had been ousted in 1958, or forced to resign, he wanted to be re-elected. And he needed to have the Muslim vote. It was very important because his party, the AFPFL, Anti-Fascist People Freedom League, had split into different factions. So he was the one who actually began to promote the old usage of the term Rohingya. Before that, it wasn't really commonly accepted at all, not even among the Muslims living there. And he promised that he should have an autonomous region in northern Rakhine State. It was then not even a state, it was called Arakan Division, comprising those three townships I just mentioned. It was going to be called the Mayo Frontier Administration. And that was successful, and he got a lot of votes for that. And suddenly there were new organizations were set up, the Rohingya Student Union in Rangoon, the Rohingya, various other Rohingya groups. They had a Rohingya language service on Burmese radio, which was called Chittagonian, mixed with some loan words from Arakanese and Burmese. So, but not really a separate language as such. But when the military took over in 1962, all that was abolished. And then also another insurgency erupted among the Rohingyas, called the Rohingya Patriotic Front. And they wanted basically the government to respect the agreement with UNU. There should be an autonomous region up in northern Arakan or Rakhine for the Rohingya Muslims. The leader of that group was Mohammed Jafar Habib, and I met him in Chittagong in the mid-80s. And he was a very reasonable person, spoke very good Burmese, was educated in Rangoon, and there was no question that he came from that area. But then he died. And then another group called the RSO, the Rohingya Solidarity Organization, emerged. And here we're talking about Rohingyas living in exile in East Pakistan, that later became Bangladesh. Not so much inside the country. They were largely unaffected by these political movements. They were based in Chittagong, they printed leaflets and all sort of things there, bulletins. And the influence among the population inside Rakhine State and the north was fairly limited, I would say. But the RSO was a far more militant group, the Rohingya Solidarity Organization, which was emerged after the death of Mohammed Jafar Habib. It was led by a man called Mohammed Yunus, who also was educated in Rangoon. He was a medical doctor, but most of his followers were actually from Bangladesh, closely connected with Jamaat Islami Bangladesh, and especially the youth organization, Islamic Shatu Shibir, which even used the RSO's camps for military training in those days. And now we have a third generation of militants, calling themselves ARSAD, Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. An interesting thing with that group, which is even more radical than any of its predecessors, is it wasn't even formed in Bangladesh. The leader, Ataullah, a second generation Rohingya born in Karachi. He was educated in Saudi Arabia, and most of the people in his inner circle also belonged to the same group of Rohingyas living in Karachi. Because there have been Rohingyas living in Karachi for about 2 generations. They sort of coming there after World War II. In the 50s, more of them moved to Karachi. First to East Pakistan, then to West Pakistan. And from there, some of them went on to Sharjah in what is now the United Arab Emirates. But they are actually in Karachi, about 30,000, 40,000, estimates vary, people of Rohingya origin or descent. And they actually, even if they were born there, are denied Pakistan citizenship. So it's not only Burma that's treating the Rohingyas badly. Even a country like their own sort of Muslim brethren in Pakistan are not treating them as full citizens. And these groups, the ARSA, did carry out a number of attacks in 2017. And then the Burmese military, the Tamado, responded with fiercely. And they pushed out an estimated 700,000 Muslims from northern Rakhine State into camps in Bangladesh. The one who had to take the blame for that was Aung San Suu Kyi, because she had become state councillor, the equivalent of prime minister, and people thought that she was responsible for it. But actually she had nothing to do with it, because under the Burmese constitution, the ministries of defense, home affairs, border affairs are controlled by the military, not by the elected government or the parliament. And this was entirely a military affair. But nevertheless, she had to take this, people then criticized her for not saying anything about it. Well, if she had said anything about it, as I said, we go back to these three things I was thinking of in 2012. Whatever she said would be wrong. Whatever she said would get international opinion against her. In the end, I don't think she even cared about that. And she was more concerned about her standing inside the country, and especially, I would say, among the Buddhist majority of the country. So she became a little bit more nationalistic, you would say, right? And then the whole issue went to, as you know, to the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, and the first hearings were held in The Hague in January this year. And she went there and with the delegation, and it was said in the media that she went there to defend the military. Actually, no. She went there to defend what she saw as the honor of the country. And she made sure that the delegation consisted only of civilians, no military. And if you listen carefully to her speech, she denied there was a genocide, of course, yes, she did. She said, yes, crimes may have been committed, but they will be dealt with under Burmese law by Burmese courts. But we know that's a joke, Burmese courts. But anyway, that's what she said. She was talking about court-martial of army personnel who had broken the law. The international reaction to her speech was, look, what an excuse for a genocide. What is she talking about? The reaction inside the country was entirely different. That day, that evening, after her speech, in downtown Rangoon, on Pansudan Street, armored personnel carriers, armored vehicles, brand carriers, as they call them in Burma, cruised downtown Rangoon as a show of force. They claimed it was a rehearsal for the 71st anniversary of the Burmese Navy. Why the Navy needs armored vehicles in the streets of Rangoon, I really don't know. But all it was to show a show of force, to say, look, we don't want any civilians to mess with this. Talking about court-martials, they were basically flexing their muscles and showing Aung San Suu Kyi her place in society. So it was completely different from what you see in international media. So there we have her. Wait, where are we? Aung San Suu Kyi. I think this actually, if I'm not mistaken, in The Hague, when she was there defending what she believed was the honor of the nation, but she also made a very grave miscalculation. Because she thought that if I go there and defend the honor of the country, the military will agree to what I want, which is amendments to the 2008 Constitution, which gives the military excessive powers. That backfired badly. Three things happened after this speech. The first was the show of force in downtown Rangoon with the brand carriers. The other was that the members of the military party, USDP, resigned from the committee that was looking into constitutional amendments. And the third was that the military demanded that the NLD, the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, government should convene a meeting with the National Security Council, which had not met even once since NLD formed the government in 2016. So the whole thing backfired badly. But it clearly wasn't that she went there to defend the military. She thought that the military would appreciate what she did. They did not. Instead, there was a massive reaction against it. See where are we? Yes, we can take this one. Right? Aung San Suu Kyi is very often referred to as the de facto leader of Burma. I never use that term in my writings. I call her the nominal leader of Burma. This gentleman is the de facto leader of Burma. General Min Aung Hlaing, the commander-in-chief of the Tamado or the Defense Services. He has much more power than she has. And there, if we're to look at the geopolitics of the whole thing, hang on, the picture before that. Hang on. Yeah. When Aung San Suu Kyi emerged as a pro-democracy icon in the late 80s, China, of course, was extremely suspicious of her. First of all, talking about democracy, and this is right after the Tiananmen Square. Those incidents sort of almost happened at the same time, right? Or a bit after the uprising in Burma. And then, moreover, her husband, Michael Aries, was a Tibet expert, a friend of the Dalai Lama. Well, naturally, the Chinese thought that this woman, really, we don't want to hear anything about her. Whereas relations with the military were actually quite good at that time, because after 1988, China was the only country that was willing to come to the rescue of the military government with loans, credits, arms supplies, support in the United Nations, and so on. Today, this has changed completely. You can see, and the reasons for that are quite simple and easy to understand. When the military decided to open up the country in 2011, 2012, it had nothing to do with suddenly having a democratic awakening experience that they said, woke up one morning and said, let's become democrats instead of dictators. They became so dependent on China, so their sovereignty was in danger. And I've seen this from internal documents from the Tamado when they're discussing this issue. We have to do this, this, and that in order to reestablish relations with the West, and India has also mentioned that, because our sovereignty is in danger. We're about to become a colony of China. This is what the military, the Tamado themselves said before all those reforms were implemented. And the other thing so after 2011, 2012, suddenly Burma changed from becoming the pariah of the world to becoming the darling of the West. Everybody went there. Obama went there twice. Everyone went there and praised this transformation to democracy. It wasn't a transformation at all. Because the military, as I said, was still in power. But they got a different facade to hide behind. And there's more openness in the country, there's no doubt about that, absolutely. I was blacklisted in Burma for decades. Now I teach journalism at a school in Rangoon. And I have no problem getting a visa. But then came the Rohingya issue, and that changed things again, completely. The West turned their backs on Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD. And sometimes I feel that the West's reaction was, how could she do this to us? We who had praised her so much, and she's doing this to us, becoming like that. Which, of course, is nonsense, because they felt sort of personally betrayed, I think, by her. But that is, you cannot really look at regional and international politics that way. This is a serious mistake. But what happened after that, after the West had turned their back on Aung San Suu Kyi, where did she go for help? To China. And suddenly she's become the darling of Xi Jinping. Whereas the military are very suspicious of her relations with China. So the tables have changed completely. It's not the military, whatever we may think about them, they see themselves as defenders of the sovereignty of the nation and all that. And with Aung San Suu Kyi running to China to get support, she's a politician. She wants to be re-elected this year. There are going to be elections in November. She needs something to show, some construction projects or whatever. And China is the only country that is willing to do that. So today, the military are the ones who want to keep a distance to China. Aung San Suu Kyi is the one who has become China's favorite candidate to run and to govern what's ever left of civilian power in the country for the next 5 years. And the Rohingyas, they will remain in the camps in Bangladesh. There's no way any government in Burma would allow them to come back. Certainly not this year with their elections looming in November. It's a Palestine kind of situation emerging in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh will have to deal with that in whichever way they want, in whichever way they can. That's a sad reality. Thank you.
We have to thank Bertil for sharing his deep knowledge of Myanmar's history and context and politics. I hadn't realized that he was in the same meeting in Oslo where the Nobel Peace Prize was being given, because I was also sitting there. So we have a bit of a history with Aung San Suu Kyi because of my Amnesty International connection. As many of you who follow Myanmar would know that, during the 20 years or so that she was under house arrest, Amnesty had been a sustained campaigner for her release. And so when she was released, Amnesty was one of the first people she was in touch with. She asked me to join her at the Oslo ceremony. And then we had a interesting situation because we were then, Amnesty was going to give Aung San Suu Kyi our highest human rights award, which is called the Ambassador of Conscience Award. In fact, just like the Nobel Peace Prize, we had given it to her, but she couldn't receive it. So we actually had a huge event in Oslo. And then there was a big bun fight as to whose private jet was going to take her from Oslo to Dublin. And the rock star Bono won that bun fight. So Aung San Suu Kyi, Bono and I flew on a private jet from Oslo to Dublin. The entire city of Dublin pretty much came out to celebrate Aung San Suu Kyi's arrival and everything that she had achieved. I have spent 2 or 3 days with her, and in my job I had to interact a great deal with heads of state and all these kind of so-called world leaders, and I have no doubt that she's one of the most exceptional leaders at the time. That I felt that she had a vision, she had spine, and all of those good things that we could think of. And I thought we had a kind of Mandela in the making, and a female Mandela at that, from Asia. So yes, I feel personally betrayed as well, and I think legitimately so, because we really, the expectations that soared. And I think that Kofi Annan, who I worked with for many years, and who was probably the only person she was still listening to on the international front after the attack that came post August 2017, when the Rohingya ethnic cleansing happened. At that point, Kofi said to me, that Salil, you really need to kind of understand what has happened here. So she's moved from being a human rights activist to being a politician. And that kind of encapsulated some part of what had happened, because once you're in politics, then it's a bit like, Aam Aadmi Party now, what's happened in Delhi. So, you then say, okay, obviously, we have to take a long view of things, we have to survive, it's better for me to be inside. So a lot of Aung San Suu Kyi's argumentation was, and also interestingly, the diplomatic community in Yangon, who, Amnesty was going and saying, why can't you do more about dealing with the accountability side of things. Their take was, imagine Myanmar without Aung San Suu Kyi. What is going to keep the military in check? So let's have this kind of checks and balances in place. But anyway, that's just to give you a little bit of where I'm coming at it from. The more important thing is to listen to Bertil. He's our visitor, and we should kind of get the most out of his understanding. So I think, Bertil, I mean, there's two ways in which I wanted to have the conversation with you. One is the Rohingya question itself, and let's go back to that a little bit more, because I think for most Indians, particularly younger Indians, probably the first time they came across, and this is not Indians, I would say globally, Myanmar kind of came on the screens when Aung San Suu Kyi came out. That was the first time everybody saw Myanmar, and then second time was when the August 2017 attack on the Rohingyas happened. That's probably the second time we kind of got to think about it. The third time probably when the Reuters journalists were locked up. I'm now fast forwarding to the more recent times, and then probably with the International Court of Justice, ICC, ICJ thing, so it's kind of coming back. Beg your pardon? Reuters, the Reuters, yeah. So, what I wanted to do is to take two angles to this conversation. One is the Rohingya angle, and the second is the India angle to the Rohingya discussion, because obviously there's the Rohingya discussion in India has now become center stage, because citizenship is now the big debate in India. Who is an Indian, what is being Indian, etc. So interestingly, it's kind of become center stage in a roundabout way. So let's come to that as well. I want to kind of contextualize the discussion that way. Now, on the Rohingya, I remember when you and I talked a little bit day before yesterday, when we had a phone conversation, one of the interesting things you said, because the world would see what happened in August 2017 when 700,000 Rohingyas had to leave. I think a lot of people would relate this to a kind of ethno-religious ethnic cleansing. That, of course, it was a fact that, there's, and for those of you who are familiar with Myanmar, you'd know that Myanmar is a very complex, diverse country with over 113 nationalities, and there's ongoing conflict in Kachin and Shan, so many places, so it's not just Rakhine is not an exception in that sense. It's got about almost 85% Buddhists, about 6% Christian, 4% Muslims. As he said, not all Muslims are Rohingya, so there's other Muslims as well. But there is certainly a perception that there's a kind of Burman majority who did have issues with the fact that Rohingyas are Muslims. So I wanted to broaden your kind of analysis of the causes. Was it, natural resources? Because one angle was Tatmadaw wanted to land grab. It's a very natural resource rich place. Then there's all the port and the Chinese strategic interest. They wanted to get their hand on the pipeline and the port and all that, so they needed to clean up some of the space there. There's also the angle which I've heard that, Rohingyas are just naturally entrepreneurs, migrants. They were way more active in the place. They had already grabbed a lot of the, there was jealousy from the local population that these people had grabbed a lot of the economic resources in the area. So tell us a bit on that, Bertil, as to what's your take on the causal factors? I think it's on. Just
hello, is it on? No. Yeah, can I hear it? Well, first of all, about the question of citizenship. I was talking previously about the Rakhine or Arakanese in Bangladesh who call themselves Myanmar. They never had a problem when it came to citizenship. And the question is, why should these Chittagonian-speaking Muslims, or whatever we want to call them, living on the other side of the Naf River, have problems with citizenship? I mean, Burma introduced in 1982 a very discriminatory citizenship law. It's usually described as an anti-Rohingya law, but that's not quite the complete picture. That law is outrageous. In order to become a full citizen of the country, of the Union of Burma, your family has to have lived in Burma prior to the first Anglo-Burmese War, 1824 to 26. No one in Burma can prove that because they have no surnames, they have no family records. But there was one way of saying that only what we consider the indigenous peoples have the right to be citizens. They would exclude migrant communities that came during the British time, mainly from India and China. But even that is not really clear-cut because you have these Muslims living in northern Arakan. They didn't move there. They've been there for a bloody long time, to be frank. And in northern Shan State, you got a whole chunk of territory called where they speak Chinese, Kokang Chinese. They speak the same dialect as the Yunnanese on the other side of the border. And they never actually had any problems with citizenship. But China is one of the only country in the world which has an ethnic Chinese minority living inside its boundaries, but it's not a migrant community. But on the other hand, you have migrants living in all the major cities, mainly Fujianese and Cantonese in Rangoon and elsewhere. And the 1982 citizenship law stripped them, all of them, of the citizenship. And that led to an exodus, not of Rohingyas at that time, but of 30,000 Sino-Burmese who suddenly became stateless. All they had been living there for generations. Many of them went to Bangkok, others went to Taiwan. That's why there's a Burma town in Taipei. And I've been there myself, and there are Chinese, but I mean, long time ago, really. And they use Burmese names, they eat Burmese food and speak Burmese. But there are Sino-Chinese ancestors. Now, of course, there's a new generation born there, which are more like local people. So, I mean, the whole citizenship issue is ridiculous. And something has to be done about it if they ever want to get peace in that country. Then comes the reason for the 2017 attacks. Honestly, I don't think natural resources would have much to do with it. There's not many resources in that area. And as for being jealous of Rohingyas, well, the number of Rohingya entrepreneurs is still fairly limited. What makes the Rohingyas different from other Muslim communities in the country is that it is a predominantly rural community. They're peasants in Mangdo, Butidang, and Ratidang. Some Rohingyas have moved to Rangoon. One of the wealthiest businessmen in construction business, Rangoon, is a Rohingya. Others have become gem dealers. You find a lot of Rohingyas in Chile, in China. The reason, I think, is that so before the attacks by the military and before they were driven out, started in August 2017, was that I saw people with contacts with the Burmese military in Rangoon before that happened. And they told me that the Tatmadaw, being fierce and nationalistic, were worried about the rapid increase of the Muslim population in that part of the country. Well, how rapid it actually was is debatable. Yes, they have larger families than the Buddhists, but still, they're a fairly small minority. But this person I talked to, who had good contacts with the Tamado, said they have a plan to reduce the percentage of Muslims in the 3 northern townships, Mongdo, Butidang, and Ratidang, from around 90% to 60, more manageable from their point of view, 60%. Because otherwise they thought there would be a demographic threat. But then came ARSA's attacks in August. And then I think they said, let's go for it, let's kick all of them out. I don't think it was any more complicated than that. China's role in the whole thing is, of course, interesting. But remember that ARSA has carried out a number of fairly small, limited attacks on Burma's security forces. A much more stronger, much more potent military force in the area is the Arakan army. It is Rakhine and it's Buddhist. They have several thousand soldiers, and some of the fiercest fighting in the civil war today is between the Rakhine army, the Arakan army, and the Burmese Tamado. And if you look at that insurgency, it's very different from any insurgency that Burma has had so far. Because in the past, like the Kachin and the Karen and Shan and so on, they wanted to establish the Communist Party. They wanted to establish these large liberated areas where they had their own schools and hospitals and administrative buildings and that sort of thing, which became easy targets for the Tamado, the military, when they attacked them, right? Because they knew exactly what to attack. The AA is very different. It's a Vietnam-style scenario emerging there. It's a guerrilla force, an invisible enemy. It strikes everywhere. It doesn't have any permanent basis. And it has lots of support from the local population. And this is something the Tamadois cannot handle. So they're firing the heavy artillery into the forest or into villages, killing more civilians than AA rebels, Arakan army rebels. So the question is, who then is behind the AA? Well, that's a different story. We can talk about that later. But you have to understand also that Arakan is a very neglected part of the country. And the Arakanese, they're not a hill people. They're plain people who once had the independent kingdom before 1785. It was conquered by the Burmese kings. They have a long and proud history. And it's one of the few states that was in the country where there's been no migration from the outside because there are no business opportunities there. Instead, the people from Rakhine state, Arakanese, mostly Buddhist, have been moving out of the state. There are thousands of them working in the Pakan jade mines in Kachin state. They're working as road construction crews in many parts of the country, just looking for jobs. Many of them are in Thailand. I don't know if you follow this case with these 2 young boys who were sentenced to death for killing, allegedly, some British tourists. They were Arakanese. And this has given birth to a very strong Arakan nationalism, which is Buddhist in Arakan, not Muslim.
But the scale at which, this happened with almost 700,000 people being pushed out, because from the way you're describing it, there was this attack, the arson attacks, and the Tatmadaw decided to do a cleanup. So was it just so unplanned, do you think, at that scale?
On that scale, I think it was. But as I said, they had a plan before that to reduce the percentage of Muslims from 90 to 60%. So they were in position, they were prepared to move. But exactly how they planned to achieve that thing from 90 to 60%, I really don't know. But I heard this before the attacks in August 2017. So they certainly had a plan. The military were there. But remember, the military were not there to fight Rohingyas at that time. They were there to fight the Arakan army. So there were several regiments already in place in Arakan state. But ARSA was a small, crazy group, badly armed.
This is part of the conversation, when I spent almost 2 hours with her finally when she met me to talk about the accountability question, because her frame was that this is an Islamic sort of thing. In private, she would say this, and that, this is an OIC-sponsored Islamic thing. She said, oh, you have had, Pakistan was created out of India, then, Bangladesh was created out of Pakistan. This is a kind of Rohingyastan being formed, and you have all these people. So I said, out of the 1 million or so people you had, how many people are fighting? This so-called ARSA must be 1,000 at best. So even that is difficult. So, but she's got that in her head. And so I want to kind of ask you a little bit on the political situation now, because we are running into the election period. So it's been a little bit complicated to understand exactly what her relationship with Senior General Min Aung Hlaing is. And I haven't been able to I mean, obviously they have to both coexist, so they have to make space for each other to operate. But do you think that, as we're going into the election period, she is going to essentially have to sleep with the enemy, so to speak?
What happened before the election, I think nobody knows, and I think it would be rather foolish if we to try to speculate. But what I can say, what has happened over the past year or past 2 years is that Aung San Suu Kyi and Min Aung Hlaing have been drifting apart. And Min Aung Hlaing hates her. He thinks that she is going to China all the time, selling out the country. And she went to The Hague and started talking about court-martials and trials of armies, of military personnel. It is his responsibility, not her responsibility. So what's going to happen before the election, I can't say. All I can say is that the military will probably go out of their way to try to beef up their political party, the USDP, the Union Solidarity Development Party, which I think is like trying to flog a dead horse into life again. It's not going to succeed. And it's always very difficult to predict elections, so you should know that in India, right? But I would be extremely surprised if NLD did not win. Yes, NLD is losing support in the urban areas, among urban intellectuals, people that foreigners usually meet. That's true. But out in the countryside, she is this female bodhisattva who's going to deliver the country from the evils of the military regime. Don't say anything bad about her when you come to a village. Don't even dream of it. But what happened after and before her appearance in The Hague was that I was in Rangoon at that time. All these big billboards came up, pictures of Aung San Suu Kyi in downtown Rangoon, or in roundabouts, right? Saying, we stand by Aung San Suu Kyi. And an NGO worker, who is a Muslim, by the way, but it doesn't mean anything, it's not important. He said, 5 years ago, she would not have needed that because everyone supported her anyway. But now, she has to remind the people of who she is and what she has done.
I think there was complete understanding. Anybody who knew the Myanmar situation, because no head of state goes to the International Court of Justice. So she showed up there because she had a domestic agenda which she wanted to maximize, and I think she got full benefit out of that for sure. So which kind of takes me to the accountability side. But again, you said that, this is a hope. The international accountability side is a hopeless cause because China is always going to back up, whether it's in the Security Council or the International Court of Justice, that, you can only go so far. But there are a lot of people would say that what happened in the ICJ, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the recent proceedings which the Gambia took to the International Court of Justice as part of the OIC, and essentially taking a genocide convention angle, which is very difficult to prove because genocide, you have to actually prove intent, not just action. So the actual likelihood of conviction is very low, but they knew that. I mean, it's not like the Gambians didn't know that or OIC didn't know that, but it creates enough pressure, it creates optics and diplomatic pressure. Similarly, in Argentina, we have a universal jurisdiction case, which is not tackling the state, but that's tackling individual, culpability of civilians as well, including the monk and, of course, Tatmadaw Senior General. So you have that happening in parallel. You have the international investigative mechanism, which is running as a result of the fact-finding mission. So as you know, there's 4 or 5 different things. The ICC has opened up an investigation. And domestically, there is a kind of, nobody really believes that's a very particularly independent commission of inquiry, but that's happened. And the commission has said that, yes, there's been disproportionate use of force. Yes, there have been war crimes. They don't accept genocide. So if this package is put together, do you think that, there is some hope either on the international side or the domestic side?
I'm sad to say no. And the reason for that is because I fear that the reaction inside the country is going to be just the very opposite. Who are these foreigners humiliating us like this? They're in league with the Muslims, aren't they? And the Muslims, this guy down the street is selling mobile phones. Let's go and attack them. I fear that the whole international spiel around this Rohingya issue may backfire on the domestic situation. And I'm not saying this is not pure speculation. I was in Burma the last time I was there was now in February. And many of the Muslims in Rangoon are worried that it would spill over into hatred against them. So many of them are going out of their way to say that they are not Rohingyas, they're taking part in nationalistic demonstrations in Rangoon and things like that. And as I said, there are many different Muslim communities in the country. Rohingyas is the only one. But if the Rohingya issue becomes the predominant issue that everyone in the outside world wants to talk about, it's going to be dangerous. And there was not that many years ago that anti-Rohingya sentiment spilled over into riots in Meiktila, in Pegu, in other towns in central Burma. And then it's becoming very, very dangerous. And I fear that this whole thing, it may sound good on paper, and it's a sort of feel-good thing that we brought the case to The Hague and all that. I'm not the only one who fears that it may have disastrous consequences at home. And remember that it's not really Buddhists against Muslims. It's not how this began. In the minds of everyone in Burma, I'm not saying I agree with this, I disagree with it, but they see the Rohingyas as illegal migrants from Bangladesh. They say, we don't want to have another Assam-style situation in our country, where Bangladesh is coming and taking over everything. I mean, there's no foundation for that belief, but that's what they think, what they will tell you if you go there.
So we're getting closer to the India-Rohingya question. Just one last question before I come to that, because you made multiple remarks about the name Rohingya, and Aung San Suu Kyi is famously known for never using the word Rohingya. So what's the politics of that terminology?
Well, if you ask any Arakanese Buddhist, why do you not accept this term, Rohingya? They will tell you immediately that two things. It sounds like Rohang, which is the name of the old Arakanese kingdom, which was Buddhist. And secondly, if you look at the emblem of any kind of political group among the Rohingyas, they always have a map of the whole of Arakan state. Not just the north, the whole state. So I'm not saying again that I agree with this, but this is what you will hear from Arakanese Buddhists. They will say that they want to steal our history and our country as well. We cannot accept that. This is the argument you will hear when this thing comes up. That is why most people in the country detest this term Rohingya as well, because they will share the Arakanese Buddhist point of view. Again, I'm not saying that I agree with this. Please don't misunderstand me. But this is the argument you will hear, and this is how they justify it.
So let me shift to the Rohingya-India connection. As I think most people in the audience will know, we have about 40,000 Rohingya in India. Most of them are in Jammu. They have been, beg your pardon? Hyderabad, Jammu, and I would say that, a lot of there has been more and more tension in the last 2 years or so, I'd say from 2017, because the government, which sees them also as Bangladeshi immigrant types, would like to deport them. There are about, I think, 7 to 12 cases of people who were deported, 7 plus 5, I think they were deported in 2017. There's a Supreme Court case which was filed in 2017, another one now which is going to be heard in mid-March by Bobde and a three-judge bench. The Special Rapporteur for CERD, which is racial discrimination, is actually put in an intervening plea as an amicus in that case. So we are in a kind of interesting stage, because as the whole discussion on hate crimes, discrimination against Rohingya inside the country, which is part of the bigger debate about Muslims in this country, is happening, now we have the NRC and the CA-NRC story coming into play. So we're now in a complex junction. So they are feeling even more insecure because they don't really know where they will stand at the end of this. 18,000 of the 40,000 have had UNHCR cards issued. Our new government is saying they don't accept UNHCR or asylum status. In fact, one of the deportee families did have a UNHCR card. So so it's a non-refoulement case. So actually, India is in violation of its international obligations. But as we know now, this is becoming less and less of an issue in this country. But it's an important test case, and it's linked to the NRC issue. So So I just want to ask, there's different angles to this. So number one is I think he wants to change your microphone. Number one is the whole citizenship question and how that plays out in India. Number two is our relationship with Bangladesh, which has already been soured, but this is getting now much more complicated if there is a big deportation which happens, or detention center use, whichever route it takes. Number three is the India-China relationship, because anything to do with Myanmar then has an implication for that as well. And I wanted to just kind of switch to the audience slightly, Bertil, on this, because I've seen an interesting pattern in this conversation, so I just want to do a show of hands on this question, and don't feel obliged to lift your hand, but I'm not doing it's not a trick question. But a lot of people in this room, I suspect, would be obviously happy with the CAA if it was non-discriminatory, and would be happy with the NRC as long as it didn't have this whole issue of exclusion of Muslims, because that's been the big debate that's been going on in the country. But a lot of people who have that view would still also believe that the Rohingyas are illegal immigrants, so they should be treated differently. So I'm just curious, with the show of hands, how many of you feel that the Rohingyas, they're not Indian Muslims, so we should not be considering them in the same way that we think of Indian Muslims? Or how many of you, or do any of you have that take on it? Because it's a legitimate view to take that, Indian Muslims is different from Muslims who've come from, because there's no debate that the Rohingyas have come from across, they're mostly those who came to Bangladesh and came through. Would anybody hold that view that, we should not equate the two? There are some hands, but some are hesitant. Okay, so that's interesting. I think so. We should, so in this context, just to kind of open it up.
Let me just add something. India is not the only country that's not recognized them as refugees and want to have them out of here. The other country is Saudi Arabia. There's about 40,000 Rohingyas living mainly around Mecca. It was only about a couple of weeks ago that the Saudi government asked the Bangladesh government, take them back. But the Bangladesh said, they're not from here. So they're stuck there. And this is the tragedy of the Rohingyas. They're stuck wherever they are. Nobody wants them. They're the most unwanted community on the planet. But again, to return to this sort of Muslim-Buddhist divide, I don't know how many times I've been addressing this issue at meetings in Burma. And I always want to emphasize that religion in the past, religion is an issue that's been used for political expediency by certain powers and that sort of thing. I always remind people of the fact that the most popular, in Burmese popular culture, there's a guy called Ushweyo. Ushweyo was this funny guy who dances around with an umbrella, with a lungi hanging on the side and so on. Every pwe, every village festival in the whole country has a Ushweyo. Who was Ushweyo? Who invented that figure? His name was Ubogale, and he was a comedian in the 1930s. Not many people know that he also had another name. His name was Muhammad Bashir. He was a Muslim. But that's the most, in Burmese popular culture, the most quintessential Burmese you can find. The architect of the Panglong Agreement, under which Burma was founded, was a diplomat called U Pe Kin. He was a Muslim. The founder of the National League for Democracy, or the two founders, U Win Tin and another man called Bacho or Mong Thoka. Yeah, every Burmese has more than one name. U Win Tin was an old Burmese Buddhist intellectual. Mong Thoka, who was a dear old friend of mine, was a former officer in the Burmese Navy. He was a Muslim. Aung San Suu Kyi's main legal advisor, I don't know if you met him, Ukuni, who was assassinated at Rangoon airport a couple of years ago. He was a Muslim. The most famous cartoonist in Mandalay is a Muslim. So where do we stop? We can go on and on forever and talk about Muslims. Rashid, who was the General Secretary of the Rangoon Students' Union in the 1930s during the struggle for independence. Among the martyrs who were killed with Aung San Suu Kyi in 1947, there were two Muslims, Sak and his bodyguard Kotwe. So Buddhists and Muslims always work together in the country. It's only when people want to use it for some political nonsense that it becomes an issue.
You're very familiar with this. So can I open it up now? We have about 20 minutes or so to go. My request, Bertil, is to get as many people into the conversation please keep your responses very short, and which means those of you asking the questions also keep it very short, please. So, okay, please start, and then we'll go back to you, sir.
You said you wanted to talk about the Arakan army, if you can expand on that. And why was Aung San Suu Kyi's legal advisor assassinated?
So can we, but let's keep, would you mind just noting some questions? Let's see if we can connect some of them. You, sir, please. At the end there. You can just stand up and speak also. We can hear you. Okay.
Yeah. All the Muslim names that you mentioned, they were Burmese Muslims. Okay? And the real problem is with a state called Rakhine, which used to be Rakhine. Here, okay, it's more of a racist tendency mixed with religion. That's the real problem. That's the real problem. Racism plus this thing. And then when you sum that up, it's actually fascism. It's actually fascism. And people have been thinking that the globalization might kill fascism. No. The opposite has happened. It's not only in this area. Means in India also, whatever that is happening is, there is a religious bent to it, but at the end of the day, it's fascism. Mm-hmm. So the fascism has been redefined in the current times. The fascism has been redefined. And people recognize fascism only after a period. They don't recognize it. Means, if they were to recognize the fascism, they would have recognized exactly when the Hitler was doing all those things. But they recognized it after 15, 20, or 30 years. That, in those days, that was never called as fascism. What is your opinion about this?
Okay, so let's get one more question from the front, and then we'll come that side. Just give it to this gentleman here, please, and then we'll accumulate your questions and then respond. Please, quickly.
You spoke a bit about how Aung San Suu Kyi had few options at her disposal, because she could either sideline herself on the domestic stage or at the international stage. What do you think about the paucity of good options for Western governments who supported her when she was under house arrest? I mean, on the one hand, they can't disagree with her too much because there's the risk of her siding with other illiberal governments in the world. So we saw her meet Orban in Hungary last year. She's friendly with the Chinese premier now. So how do you think the West should balance this situation? And this is quite similar to many third world countries in Asia, in Africa. And yeah,
good point. Bertil, why don't you take some of these and just...
Okay, that's all. First of all, assassination. He was not assassinated because he was a Muslim. He was assassinated because he was working on the new constitution. The media at that time was a highlight the fact he was a Muslim. Connie was a dear old friend of mine. We worked together on many projects in Burma. And after I went to his funeral. It was packed, 20,000, 30,000 people, many Buddhists as well. And after that, I went to see his family, his daughters. And I asked him, is it okay if I write that he was working on a new constitution? Because that's what he had told me that he was doing. And his daughter said, yes, please do that, because we don't want anyone to think that he was shot because he was a Muslim. He was working for everyone in the country, regardless of religion.
So why was he shot because he was working in the country?
Because, okay, now we're getting into very detailed things here. He was an expert in finding loopholes in the law and the constitution. He was a legal expert, he was a lawyer. And he tried to tell Aung San Suu Kyi that forget about trying to amend the constitution, because you need more than 75% of the MPs to vote in favor, and as long as the military control 25%, forget about it. But, he said, this is what he told me in private conversations, they forgot to put something in their constitution, how to abolish it. So he said, legally, we can have a single vote in the parliament, throw out the constitution and adopt a new one, perfectly legal. Suu Kyi was against it. She thought it would be too provocative. He was saying that that is our only chance. The military knew about that. He was writing a new constitution. That's why he was killed.
Keep going.
Okay, the question, fascism. Well, Arakan army. Well, the Arakan army is a new phenomenon. And I've told a little bit briefly, it's a guerrilla force, like Viet Cong style, Vietnam. And they already want the hearts and the minds of the people where they're operating. The question is, of course, where are they getting the weapons from? And they got plenty. They're getting them from the Wa, and they are getting it from China. Then we may ask ourselves, why would China be interested in stirring up all this trouble in Arakan state? Well, if you look at it in the short term, of course, it sounds crazy. They want to have, the deep sea port at Chokpyu, the railways and all that. But look at it in the longer perspective. This will turn China into a player in Arakan state in a way it was not before. They will become the kingmaker, the peacemaker, the only one who can sort the problem out, sort it out for the government and for the Tamado. So you look at it in the long term, I'm not saying that this is how the Rakhine villagers think about it, who are supporting the AA, but China certainly has an interest in supporting the insurgency there, absolutely. In the same way as they're supporting insurgencies in northern Shan state, to gain influence, to become a player, to become a broker between the government and the rebels, and to show the government, we are the only ones who can sort this out for you. Nobody else can. Forget about these stupid foreigners, right? Okay, then about fascism. Well, I don't really want to talk about fascism as such. They will be pushing it a bit too far. But nevertheless, you're right. There are extremist groups emerging in Burma. The most prominent one is, of course, Mabata and Uviratu, this young monk who makes sort of crazy speeches and that sort of thing. I actually met Viratu, and he's a very shrewd operator. He knows exactly how to play the audience in the public. When I met him in Mandalay, he said that, okay, I'm going to have my meal now. So I sent one of my novices, my boys, to show you around here, right? And then we will meet in the library after 12, after I had my meal. I mean, monks have to eat before noon, right? So I thought, okay, he's got a plan here. So I came to the library, and there was a table like this, some fruit here, place for Viratu, place for me, and a camera. So I thought, this is going to be on his video site tomorrow. And it's going to show that, look, even Bertil Lintner is coming, paying respect to Viratu. And I use this when I teach journalism in the country as an example of how you would have to behave when you're in a situation like that. So I sat here like this all the time with my pen, showing that I'm here for an interview and nothing else. And sure enough, this little video clip appeared on his website the day after. And some in the comments, Anna said, what is Bertil Lintner doing talking to Viratu? Somebody answered, can't you see, he's interviewing him. And that person was a Muslim. So it worked. But I mean, people like him are dangerous, absolutely. And especially when things sort of get totally out of hand, like they did in Mengtila a couple of years ago, just south of Mandalay, in the central heartland. And you are right also, the Rohingyas are different. Is this a racist thing against them because they look different, they dress differently, they speak a different language, and then therefore they don't see them as indigenous. They are interlopers from Bangladesh. Even Aung San Suu Kyi would say that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Let's come this side, then we'll come back. Oh yeah, last question was not answered.
Was what?
About the international support that she's building up with all these dictators and the Western, whether the West should be taking a different position.
I don't know how many times I met Westerners who are involved in Burma, and the first thing I tell them is that please take off your white messiah hat. You are not going to influence these people. Forget about it. They don't want to listen to you. To them, you are Myokpyu, which means white monkeys. And all of these foreigners are there, and there's dozens of them in Rangoon. They clearly overestimate their own importance and the degree of influence they have in there. They think they can have a discussion and they will change their minds. Forget about it. It's not going to happen. I don't think outside pressure is going to work at all.
Well, I think there's some striking similarities with the Indian situation because Myanmar is also seen as the last Asian frontier. There's a big market, natural resources. So the corporate interest is also very big. So even the Western powers who otherwise feel that they can push will be silent because they get pushed back by their corporate lobbies as well. So.
Well, India, as you know, has not come out criticizing the Burmese over the Rohingya issue.
There's what?
India has not criticized Burma over the Rohingya issue.
No, we're very happy.
Oh, yes, I can show that.
Yeah. So let's, Nina, please.
I would like to do the same here, maybe.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia. and the fact these 40,000 Rohingyas that they want Burma to take them back, Myanmar to take them back. Bangladesh to take them back. You know, I interviewed a Rohingya leader in the 1990s under great pressure from the Saudis, and they wanted me to run exactly what he said, which is that they were oppressed, and it was not the Buddhist versus Muslim, it was about the OIC promoting the cause of the Rohingyas. Why has that changed? And secondly, Amal Clooney is apparently the lawyer who's taken up the Rohingya case in the ICJ. Do you think it's going to become a very big issue, and will it actually embarrass? I mean, she did get the Maldivian.
Gambia and the Maldives,
yes.
two very powerful nations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could you tell us something about the Saudis and why that relationship has soured?
Well, I think that they think that if they put enough pressure on the Burmese government, then the Rohingyas can go back. Actually,
What was the original, why was the OIC backing the Rohingyas in the
I think,
beginning?
Nina, this is a different Saudi Arabia from the 1990s Saudi. But now, the thing is that that's a whole, we should ask Ravi to organize a separate discussion on what is this new Saudi Arabia in relation to Iran, in relation to Israel. So it's not the Saudi Arabia that you'd historically think of, I think. So I'd just like to get a few more voices, if you don't mind. Who are the other, please? Please, go on. Okay, go on, say it.
There are two types of Burmese in Saudi Arabia. There are Saudi Arabian people who have given them the refuge in 80s. Those were different Burmese. And now, in those days, the Rohingya problem was not there. The Rohingya problem, they do not want to hold because they already have some of the Burmese there. So that's fine.
Okay.
I live in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. Please.
That's a long history, but you can say it started during World War II, when the Muslims sided with the British, they were loyal to the British, the Arakanese Buddhists sided with the Japanese, and they killed each other. There were massacres on both sides, really. When the war was over, World War II was over, a lot of Muslims from northern Arakan ended up in camps in what became East Pakistan. Many of them didn't quite like it there, so they continued to West Pakistan and settled in Karachi. From Karachi, they migrated across the Gulf, and first they settled in Sharjah, which is now part of the UAE, of course. And I've been to China several times, and I met the founder of the Rohingya community there, an old, very wealthy businessman, who remembers when the first car arrived in Dubai. Can you imagine? It's a long time ago. And from there, I think they migrated on to Saudi Arabia. Exactly how they end up in Saudi Arabia, I'm sure you know more about that than I do. But the main communities outside Burma, outside this region, would be Sharjah, around Mecca, and Karachi. And then you got smaller communities scattered around the globe.
So please.
My question is sort of moving away from Rakhine State. Obviously, as you mentioned, there are a lot of conflicts in other states of Burma, like Shan and Kachin. Looking at the elections coming up, if NLD was to win, what do you think are the implications for the other conflicts that are happening in the country?
Let's get a few more from this side. Are there any more questions on this side? Yeah, please, go ahead.
I'm just looking at another angle. Is there a link between how the economy performs and social tensions?
Anyone on this side? Or should we get, so I was just, yeah, please. So.
Have the Indian, I wouldn't know what the word fascists here applies, supported and abetted whatever the fascists on the other side have done?
We have so many fascists now, we know which one to choose from. I just wanted to say one thing before you respond on the human rights violations more broadly in Myanmar, because I think you're right to say that the Rohingya issue gets kind of more visibility simply because it is so dramatic. And there are ongoing violations of very serious nature with all of the different ethnic groups. I mean, we're talking about not just arbitrary detention, but torture, incommunicado, detention, forced labor. There's lots and lots of issues. And the interesting thing is that some of the Tatmadaw units who are involved in some of the most egregious violations are the very same Tatmadaw units. So, and they have full impunity that they have. That's the challenge, So I'm not hopeful that the elections will change it unless Daw Suu decides that she's a new person, post-elections. So,
I'm not holding my breath on that one. But about energy in the elections, it's actually quite interesting because they just enacted a new law. The government, the parliament has some power. Some laws they can enact without having to ask the military. And previously, if you lived in an ethnic state for more than 180 days, you had the right to vote in that particular state. Now they shortened that to 90 days. That's 3 months. That means that the thousands of Rakhine, and I'm talking about Buddhist Rakhine, migrant workers in Kachin State can vote in Kachin State. Or the Burmese migrant workers in Shan State can vote there. This, I'm sure, was NLD's attempt to undermine the ethnic parties, to make them... I mean, the joke when I was in Rangoon was that the Arakan Nationalist Party is going to win the elections in Kachin State if they introduce this law. So certainly, no, I cannot see how the NLD government would become more sensitive to any ethnic issues in what they have been, any more than they've been in the past. As I said before, I think Aung San Suu Kyi's main shortcoming from the very beginning was that she didn't really understand the ethnic problems facing the country. The economy and social tensions, yes, of course they're connected. I mean, if the economy performs well, then there's less incentive to go out and burn down shops and that sort of thing, or start a riot. But this, I think, is something that goes on. It's nothing particular for this point in time in history. And as for fascists, well, I think I leave that one.
I just wanted to say on that point, sir, that when I was in Nay Pyi Taw to meet Daw Suu, in the hotel I was staying in, we had a very senior person from the Indian Navy staying there. Obviously, the whole issue of the geostrategy, Anand is the one who should talk more about this offline maybe. I have no doubt that there are, connections between different actors who are on the same side of the kind of thinking. So how active it is, I wouldn't know, but certainly, there is, we can't say that these are not unconnected, these are totally disconnected. They're not. Governments operate in close concert when they have common interests. So let me just see if there's any last, please, at the back, go ahead. Any more hands? So just I know how many people are left. Anu, okay.
Thank you, Bertil, for such a good talk. I happened to live in Dhaka when the influx started happening in August. And there was a big panic which was happening around during that time. And I also happened to visit that camp in September, October. And while all the questions come around that how we going to fix the diplomacy, what can we do, pressures, what kept reminding me and my friends who works at BRAC and Red Cross, we kept thinking and traumatizing story. And as you said, as we are thinking it's a genocide and stuff like that, still things gets continued where, like, it's very traumatic to kind of hear those stories. So I just wanted to ask you, not from a futuristic angle, that what's the pressure we're going to put to make things happen, change, but I just want to ask from a present question and the kind of stories I've heard is, it's a very simple question, is what is the future of the people who are living in those camps right now? The forest being taken down, the elephant corridors being taken down, and what they are only hoping, because one of my questions when I went there was, are these people going to learn Bengali? And the Sheikh Hasina has said, no, they're going to not learn Bengali because that's going to seep through the country, right? And so they can't learn that. So what's the future of these people or the families I've met?
Yeah. Anu, please, last question, and then we'll start closing, please.
Sure. Yeah, I had a quick question on, you mentioned the Citizenship Act that Burma passed a long time ago. In that sounded really scary, and since we are all in the throes of a Citizenship Amendment Act, I'm curious as to how that act I mean, were all the Rohingyas not citizens of the country, and were there lots of other groups who didn't make it to citizenship due to such a egregious act?
Can I, Bertil, just quickly respond to our friend on Bangladesh, because we didn't really focus on Bangladesh in this conversation. And so I think Bertil already answered it, that we are now in a kind of frozen conflict, Palestine type situation. That's not going to change. Bangladesh is, they started with, we have to really, take our hats off to Bangladesh for accepting almost 1 million people in a couple of phases. But as you know, in the most recent past, they've actually turned the internet off. There's been lots of tension, as always happens, between the local population and Sheikh Hasina. Well, she wanted to, she had aspirations of being mother of humanity, etc. Now it's got a bit more, frosty, the relationship. And there's really issues on the camps in terms of drugs and, sort of radicalization and all of that. But the education access has been allowed. So I think she's also come to terms with the reality that they're not going anywhere. So as you know, 2 months ago, now the kids are allowed to go into the mainstream schools. I mean, of course, we have 700,000 people. They're all smart, entrepreneurial people. They've already found ways of operating in that context. So whatever be the official system, a lot of aid has gone in. So, I mean, our own assessment in Cox's Bazar, working with BRAC, etc., was overall, it wasn't such a, if you look at camps in the rest of the world, they were being treated reasonably well. But that's now starting to change. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think you already answered that question. That is a Palestine kind of scenario emerging there. Yeah, they do speak the Chittagonian version of Bengali mixed with loan words. But I mean, those Rohingyas who've been in Bangladesh for more than a couple of years. Remember, many of them came much earlier than this most recent influx. Some of them came in the early 90s. They speak standard Bengali by now. And they can mix with the rest of the population of Bangladesh. Well, I think it's up to how much, money, how much taka they got. Well, the 1982 citizenship law, no, you're right. It affected anyone who was of Chinese or subcontinental ancestry, everyone, not only Rohingyas. There's a small part of it. And if you go back to I went back to what the newspapers wrote about in 1982, and actually no one mentioned Rohingyas in 1982. They mentioned the Chinese, they mentioned the Indians people of Indian ancestry living in Rangoon and so on. And they lost their citizenship, yes, sure. And that's why many of them left the country. Those who stayed were issued what are called FRCs, foreign registration cards, which gives them some kind of status but not citizenship.
So one of the good things about the BIC is they start on time and end on time. I was hoping that, Bertil, you would announce that Sweden will accept the Rohingya population, as they have been so generous in accepting so many other refugees, but that has not happened. We hope that you will do that.
Well, I haven't lived in Sweden for 40 years, so it's a little bit difficult to me in that situation.
Thank you very much for all your inputs.